Hi, I'm Alicia Mann.
Sarah Burton.
I'm Christina Dunlap.
And I'm Kristen Dillon.
We're going to do a summary of chapters 9 and 11 of An Essential History of Current Reading Practices.
Our first chapter was chapter 9, and it was titled 50 Years of Remedial and Clinical Reading in the United States, a Historical Overview. And it started out saying, why do teachers need to know the history of reading instruction? They will, one, know the paths already taken to examine the enigma of reading delays. They will not repeat history, and they will be aware of the immoderate swings in trends that have plagued the remedial and clinical reading field over the last century. Each era in this presentation is laid out in 3 categories. The first category is causation, which reflects research or attitudes in that era about what contributes to or causes reading delay. The second one will be instruction and assessment, which reports strategies and tools used at that time to instruct delayed readers or to test their reading competence. And the third one will be milestones, which relates events that influence the treatment of delayed readers and the profession of reading education. We started the 1800s all the way to the 1940s, and they talked about the causation of reading delay. In the late 1800s, we believed that reading difficulties could be attributed to word blindness, and word blindness was considered a congenital defect. They also believed that those who had intact vision had reading difficulties because they were unable to see print. By the late 1920s, the theory of word blindness had been discarded, and Orton proposed that letter and word reversals were the defining hallmark of reading disability. Reversals resulted from failure to establish cerebral dominance. There was also a competing theory of Orton, which said that faulty eye movements were the cause of delayed reading achievement. Both of these theories have been dismissed. In the 1930s, the theory for the cause of reading disability was emotional disturbance. And in the 1940s, they believed eye defects led to reading disabilities. And there was the rise of the theory of multiple causation, which said there can be multiple causes of poor reading, and they may vary from individual to individual. This was the first viable hypothesis of reading delay.
In the 1800s to the 1940s, they came up with instruction and assessment. In the early 1900s, Schmidt developed the first instructional method aimed at non-readers. It was a technique involving the use of intricate, highly wrought phonic stories. William S. Gray developed the Gray Oral Reading Test, and this was used for decades by reading teachers to classify students' reading behaviors while the students were actually reading. In the 1940s, the informal reading inventory became popular, and this is something that we still use today.
Milestones from the 1800s to the 1940s. In 1916, the first journal article in the U.S. that was focusing on reading disabilities, remedial reading. The term was used the first time in this article. In the 1920s, was the first reading clinic opened. It was a university-based clinic at UCLA, and it was directed by Grace Fernald. In 1922, the first university textbook devoted to remedial reading was published. It was called Deficiencies in Reading Ability, Their Diagnosis and Remedies by Clarence T. Gray. And in the late 1940s, the learning disabilities movement began.
This is a summary of the 1800s through the 1940s of instruction and assessment and milestones and causations.
In the 1950s, in the early 1950s, it was thought that emotional disturbances were thought to cause reading delays. By the late 1950s, they thought physiological and neurological factors contributed to reading delays. In 1955, Flesch wrote Why Johnny Can't Read, which said of the lack of reading progress in the United States in the school system was due to the presence of whole word method teaching strategies. In 1957, Vernon wrote Backwardness in Reading, which said visual perception problems was a source of reading disability. In 1959, Delicato proposed a lack of neurological organization caused reading delays.
He introduced a treatment program that relied primarily on body management activities, but this was not a viable idea.
The instruction and assessment in the 1950s, there was a language and experience approach. This was used in the first grade classrooms, and they used the students' own language for reading text. This was seen as an easier, more natural way to learn than using basal readers. The Labach method employed tutors to teach adults to read, and these were the first programs at universities to train reading specialists. In 1953, Spock introduced a formula for estimating reading levels, and this was based on vocabulary and sentence difficulty.
The milestones in the 1950s, the launch of the International Reading Association, and there was the first publication of the Reading Teacher.
This is the 1950s summary of instruction and assessment and milestones and causation. From 1960 to 1964, it was believed that reading disabilities involved physiological or neurological problems of the brain. Some proposed that brain damage was a cause of reading delay. Others believed that cognitive functions of the brain's right or left side contributed to reading problems. Neither hypothesis stood the test of time.
In the early 1960s, there was an instructional program that included much reading of text and the development of diverse reading strategies. In 1960, Kephart wrote The Slow Learner in the Classroom, and he used body management activities such as walking on balance beams and tossing beanbags, and this was used to remediate reading difficulties, but this proved to be ineffective. In 1961, Kirk and McCarthy developed the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities, which assessed delayed readers for so-called visual processing and auditory problems. In 1963, Clymer did a content analysis of children's reading material, and this showed that many of the rules that teachers taught for phonic analysis were not useful. This changed what and how teachers taught phonics.
The milestones from 1960 to 1964. In 1960, Samuel Kirk, a special education teacher, suggested that the many labels currently in use for persons with the same types of learning disabilities be grouped into one term. This led to the adoption of the term learning disabilities or learning disabled. Here are some terms that were used prior to 1963, and after 1963, they all became learning disabled. State certification for reading teachers began during this time period, and the first reading diagnostics test, especially for adults, was designed.
This is the summary of 1960 to 1964 of instruction and assessment and milestones and causation. From 1965 to 1969, the hypothesis of brain damage and divergent brain functioning from the early 1960s continued to be accepted. There was an addition of visual motor defects being a cause of reading delays. They basically said the lack of hand-eye coordination was an underlying problem for reading delays.
Instruction and assessment from 1965 to 1969. In 1965, Getman proposed using oculomotor control to remediate assumed visual motor deficits. Students in learning disabled and remedial reading classes were required to follow moving targets with their eyes. In the late 1960s, the notion that students could learn to read more readily if they were taught through their strongest modality. Both of these methods failed. In the late 1960s, the Orton-Gillingham approach used intensive graphing phoning orientation in which letter-sound associations are practiced first in isolation and then in individual words for fairly long periods of time before using the information to read connected text. This is still used today. In 1966, the Hirsch, Jansky, and Langford wrote Predicting Reading Failure, and this presented a criteria for identifying precursors to reading difficulty. In 1968, Fry developed a new readability formula for assessment of reading material.
The milestones from 1965 to 1969. In 1965, the U.S. Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was the origin of the Title I reading programs. There was also the first publication of Reading Research Quarterly. It was sponsored by the International Reading Association and has been the most important source of research in reading.
This is the summary for 1965 through 1969 of instruction and assessment and milestones and causation.
In the 1970s, the theory of multiple causation remained the belief of most reading professionals. In 1975, Ballow, Rubin, and Ross's article said that low birth weight and premature birth had effects on reading delay. This merited further investigation. In 1978-1979, Valton wrote an article titled Dyslexia, Deficit in Reading or Deficit in Research. This questioned the investigation on reading disabilities. This influenced the quality of research in reading.
In the 1970s, there was a diagnostic and prescriptive teaching method which specific reading objectives were stated. Students were given a pretest and instruction keyed toward the unmastered objectives were used. In 1971,
The milestones in the 1970s. In 1970, the National Right to Read program was created. It was the forerunner of No Child Left Behind. It heightened interest in reading instruction. 1975, Public Law 94-142, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This strengthened educational requirements for learning disabled and other special education students. During the 1970s, Sesame Street and the Electric Company also were created to promote reading growth.
This is the 1970s summary of instruction and assessment milestones and causation.
In the 1980s, multiple causation was the most widely accepted causal theory of reading delays. It attempted to find one cause. The attempts to find one cause of reading delay vanished, and it appeared to be a complexity of causes that cause reading delay.
In 1980, Stanovich presented an interactive
Compensatory reading model. When readers are unable to use one process to identify words, they compensate by using another process.
In the 1980s, many researchers began affecting instruction for delayed readers through investigations. Interest in the literacy of low-achieving adults. There was a continuation of the 1970s initiatives, which investigation of comprehension process and comprehension instruction along with comprehension assessment.
The milestones in the 1980s. 1987, McGill, Franzen published Failure to Learn to Read, Formulating a Policy Problem. Urged literacy instructors to involve themselves in struggling readers' policy issues.
This is the 1980s summary of instruction and assessment and milestones and causation.
In the 1990s, there was the rise of the idea that poor readers were lacking phonemic awareness.
In 1990, it was Beginning to Read, Thinking, and Learning About Print by Adams, which brought about an acceptance of phonic analysis as useful word identification strategy. In the early 90s, there was the Reading Recovery Program, which helped beginning readers who were experiencing reading delays.
The milestones in the 1990s. 1998, the publication of a major report preventing reading difficulties in young children. It provided informed and reasoned discussions of research. It contained research-derived recommendations for reading instruction.
This is the 1990s summary of instruction and assessment and milestones and causation.
From 2000 to 2007, there was strong evidence for the role of phonemic awareness in reading delay. PET scans and MRIs were developed, and this revived some interest in the relationship of neurological factors causing reading difficulties.
The instruction and assessment from 2000 to 2007, there was an emphasis on research-based instruction, which led to the No Child Left Behind. In this policy, it emphasized highly qualified teachers. It focused on what is done in teacher education programs. There's a strong emphasis on professional development. It had the use of literacy coaches, which were teachers who assist other teachers in professional development, and the assessment of struggling readers tied to state standards.
The milestones in 2000 to 2007. 2000, the National Reading Panel specified the 5 essential components of primary grade reading instruction: phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluence, and comprehension. In 2001, No Child Left Behind.
And this is the summary for 2000-2007 for instruction, assessment, and milestones and causation. In an article published in Reading Research Quarterly, Bowman and colleagues compared responses from teachers today to responses from an article written in 1963. In both time periods, regular classroom teachers said understanding how to help struggling readers in their classroom was their biggest problem. The final thoughts: hypotheses of the causes of reading difficulties have evolved, assessment approaches have been refined, instruction has become more effective. Now seen as explorations through which further learning is accomplished. Idea of learning to spell as a constructive conceptual process supported emerging work on the writing process, and children were acting as amateur phoneticians.
Developmental patterns. Henderson created stage theory: pre-phonetic, pre-alphabetic, semi-phonetic, early alphabetic, letter name, phonetic, alphabetic, within word pattern, transitional, syllable juncture, and durational consistency. Students aren't simply learning individual spellings, but are actively constructing and applying ideas about how the spelling system works.
Delayed spellers. Disabled spellers' difficulties are more likely related to delays in learning rather than differences in processing.
Reading spelling connections. Going from print to sound is different from going from sound to print. Can use context as partial cues from letters in a word, but not the same for aiding a writer in producing a correct spelling.
Spelling assessment and instruction. Formal inventory is associated with independent instructional and frustration levels. Use of student writing were used as information on student knowledge and ability and a source for instruction. This trend was used as rationale for eliminating textbooks, encouraging teachers to design own spelling programs. Uniformed and unsupported teachers may choose inappropriate words for instruction, resort to traditional materials, or reduce the time and energy put into word study. New approach offered: stress the value of assessing to determine developmental stage and/or instructional levels to focus instruction on those levels.
Words chosen for frequency, familiarity, and/or relevance to curriculum, but also for features whose spellings reveal student stages. Student profiles built from this information reveal a pattern of student strengths and weaknesses used to drive instruction.
Instruction approach to spelling from developmental perspective differs from traditional instruction. Rather than rote memorization, students are grouped for instruction according to their knowledge and needs. Activities and procedures are aimed at increasing students' active engagement through hands-on manipulation and through discussion about individual words and patterns. More integrated programs of more study meant to build word knowledge for reading and spelling.
Changing perspectives on vocabulary knowledge. Strong connection between vocabulary knowledge and reading achievement.
The nature of English vocabulary. English has more words than any other language. Combining morphemic elements is a significant process for building English words. In the written text, words with affixes outnumber single morpheme words by 4 to 1. More than half the words in the school English are formed by suffixation, prefixation, and compounding. 60% of new words acquired by school-aged children are morphologically complex, but with relatively transparent morphological structures. Beyond primary grades, relationships between pronunciations and spellings can be complex.
Instructional issues. Lexical access, access to meanings of words is a key to successful reading. The number of new words students encounter in school years is considerable. 88,000 meaning families are in school for English. The average high school senior knows approximately 40,000 words. Typical students learn approximately 3,000 words per year from 3rd to 12th grades. The size of children's vocabulary doubles between the 3rd to 7th grades. On the other hand, estimates suggested that no more than 500 words can be taught effectively in a year of focused vocabulary instruction.
The vast majority of words learned by students who become literate adults are learned in context through wide reading, assigned or unassigned. Unwise to minimize the value of direct and focused vocabulary instruction. High-achieving students do more reading than lower achievers and in more demanding text, and this leads to the Matthew effect. Context alone rarely provides sufficient information to unlock a word's meaning completely and specifically, and can be misleading. An effective approach will include regular and direct teaching of a chosen set of words.
Traditional instruction of skill and drill is insufficient. Blachowicz and Fisher suggest 4 research-supported principles that should be incorporated to make vocabulary instructive effective. 1 is students should be actively involved in word learning. 2, word learning should include a personalized component. 3, students should be immersed in words. And 4, multiple sources and repeated exposure should be incorporated.
The early vocabulary development. There's a strong relationship between oral vocabulary in 1st grade reading and achievement in 11th. What parents say and do with children's language development in the first 3 years has enormous impact. At 30 months of age, children with welfare had an average vocabulary of less than half as the children in professional families. Children on welfare were adding fewer numbers of words to their already smaller vocabularies. By the end of 2nd grade, average children have acquired approximately 6,000 root word meanings.